The glass cracked on the third try. Not the window, the hope. Rail Dunmore pressed his forehead against the cold observation panel of Geneva Accord Station and watched the sun pull itself over the Alps like it owed no one an apology. He had not slept. He had not eaten since yesterday noon. And 3 hours ago, the Galactic Conclave had formally rejected humanity's null-tide proposal for the 4th time in 8 months. Down the hall, the alien delegations were filing out of the session chamber. He could hear their translators humming, their strange footsteps, the soft click of Dorath's chitin limbs on the floor. Ambassador Dorath had not even looked at Rail when the vote was announced. That was worse than the rejection itself. Siona Marsh appeared beside him with 2 cups of something warm. She handed him one without asking if he wanted it. 14 months, Rail said. I know. Before the tide reaches the outer system. I know, Rails. He drank, it tasted like nothing. They called our proposal emotionally driven, like that's a bad thing. Siona leaned against the panel beside him. She was the best xenobiologist Earth had ever produced, and she looked, at this moment, like someone who had been asked to translate a language that did not exist. Dorath's exact words were structurally impulsive and biologically short-sighted. I filed a rebuttal. It will take 6 weeks to reach the review board. We have 14 months. Yes. Outside, the Alps turned gold. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then every alarm on the station went off at once. Not the soft amber warning tone used for satellite drift or atmospheric pressure, the hard red alert, the one that had a different pitch, a different weight, the kind that made your body move before your brain caught up. Rail was already running when the intercom crackled and a junior officer's voice came through, stripped of all professional calm. Commander, Platform 7, you need to see this right now. Platform 7 was an external landing deck used for supply drones. No ships were scheduled. No transit signature had been detected. Nothing had come through any gate or relay. The station's entire perimeter sensor grid had registered nothing until 30 seconds ago when something simply appeared. They found it in the center of the platform, surrounded by 3 security officers who had not drawn their weapons because none of them could figure out if what they were looking at was a threat or a miracle. It was a dragon. Not a full-grown Velthori, not one of the ancient silver giants that sat on the Conclave's inner council with their crystalline horns and their 40,000-year stares. This was a hatchling, small enough that Rail could have picked it up, though he did not. Its scales were silver blue, still soft-looking, catching the sunrise and throwing it back in fractured violet and pale gold. Its 4 wings were folded tight and slightly damp, like something newly emerged. Its legs trembled with the effort of holding itself upright. In its forepaws, pressed carefully against its chest, it held an object, a sphere of living light, pulsing slow and warm like a second heartbeat, with a double helix shape turning slowly inside the glow. The hatchling looked up at Rail with enormous violet eyes. Then it looked at Siona. It took 3 careful steps toward her and stopped. Siona did not move. She was running every xenobiological protocol she had ever learned, which meant she kept her hands still, her breathing low, and said nothing. The hatchling made a sound. It was not in any conclave language. It was not in any language at all. It was somewhere between a hum and a word, barely formed, like a thought that had not yet learned how to be spoken. Vaya, it said, or something like it. Siona said, very quietly, hello. Rail's communicator lit up 17 times in the next 4 minutes. The Velthori faction, the Conclave Emergency Channel, Earth's Foreign Affairs Office, 3 separate Conclave science departments. He silenced all of them and watched Siona crouch down slowly to the hatchling's level. The object in the hatchling's forepaws pulsed brighter. When the tip of Siona's finger came within 6 inches of it, the light changed color entirely, shifting from pale gold to something deep blue-white, steady and strong, the way a star looks in deep space when there's nothing between you and it. Behind them, someone had pulled the platform's historical records. An officer read the finding aloud, voice careful and flat, like she was trying not to attach meaning to what she was saying. The object matches the recorded description of the Sorvan key, lost in the year 187 of the Conclave Standard Calendar, approximately 2,000 years ago. She paused. It was believed destroyed. Rael turned to look at her. Believed by who? She checked her screen. By the Conclave. The hatchling pressed the key gently towards Siona's hand. It was not offering it, it was showing her. There was a difference, and Rael could feel it, the way you feel when someone is trying to tell you something they don't yet have the words for. He had spent 20 years in the field. He knew intent when he saw it. His communicator lit up again. This time the channel code was one he had only seen once in training. Velthori High Council, Emergency Direct Line. He answered. The voice that came through was old in a way that made old sound like a small word. Commander Dunmore, it said, that hatchling belongs to us. Return it immediately. Rael looked at the hatchling. The hatchling was still looking at Siona. I'll have to get back to you on that, he said, and ended the call. The Velthori arrived 6 hours later in a ship that made the station look like a pebble beside a cathedral. 3 of them came through the docking bridge. Elder Navan, whose horns were the length of a man and the color of deep ice. Elder Sorath, who had not spoken in open council for 200 years and chose today to break that streak. And Elder Tavan, the youngest of the 3 at a mere 4,000 years, whose silver-blue scales were the same shade as the hatchlings, which Rael noted and said nothing about. They filled the corridor just by being in it. Security stepped back without being told to. Even Ambassador Dorath, who had once told Rael that he found human instincts charmingly primitive, moved to the side of the hall as the elders passed. Rael walked beside them. He had decided, sometime in the last hour, that he was going to be polite for exactly as long as he could manage. The hatchling is safe, he said. Dr. Marsh is with it in the observation suite. It is not an it, Elder Navan said. Velthori hatchlings carry no gender until they choose one. Refer to Veya as Veya. Rael filed that away. Veya is safe. Veya is calm. We haven't touched the key. You should not have touched anything. Navan's translator gave the words a flat edge. A hatchling appearing without a bonding event, without a nest, without an elder present, this is not natural. Something is wrong with Veya. We will take Veya home and assess. With respect, Rael said, Veya chose to come here. Sorath spoke for the first time. The translator took a moment to catch up, like even the technology wasn't prepared. Hatchlings do not choose, they bond, they follow instinct. Whatever brought Veya here was confusion, not intention. They reached the observation suite. Rael opened the door. The 3 elders stopped in the doorway. Inside, Siona was sitting cross-legged on the floor. Veya was 3 feet away, also sitting, watching her. Between them, Siona had drawn a series of shapes on a sheet of paper. Simple things, a circle, a line, a wave. As they watched, Veya reached out one small forepaw and touched the wave, then looked at Siona. Siona drew a second wave, slightly different. Veya made the sound, Veya, then touched the first wave again. They had been doing this for 4 hours. Elder Navan stepped inside. The moment Navan's shadow crossed the threshold, Veya's head snapped up. Every muscle in the small body went rigid. The hatchling backed up 3 steps, pressed against the far wall, and made a sound that no translator could process because it had never been catalogued. No one in Conclave history had ever heard a hatchling make that sound at an elder. The silence that followed was the kind that changes rooms. Veya, Navan said softly. The translator added inflections Rael couldn't read. Veya, come. Veya did not move. Tavan stepped forward slowly, past Navan, past Sorath. She lowered herself in a gesture Rael didn't know, but Siona recognized. She had read about it once, a Velthori gesture of absolute non-threat, used between bonded pairs during illness or fear. It was not a gesture elders used with hatchlings. It went the other way. Veya looked at Tavan, looked at Siona, looked at the key in its own forepaws. Then very slowly, Veya sat back down, not toward Tavan, back in front of Siona. Tavan stood up. Her face, if a dragon's face could be read, carried something that Siona later described in her notes as the expression of someone who already knows what they are about to be told and has been dreading it for a long time. Outside the suite, in the corridor, Rael's lead mathematician, a man named Bryn who had been awake for 31 hours, came jogging around the corner with a tablet in his hand. "The pulse," Bryn said, breathless. "From the key, the rhythm it's been broadcasting since it got here. We've been running it through every analytical model we have." Rael took the tablet and... "It's a sequence, mathematical. We think it's been repeating since before we even got to Platform 7, maybe longer. We only picked it up an hour ago because we didn't know to listen for it." Bryn tapped the screen. "It's not language, it's structure, a map of resonance frequencies in dimensional space. Sir, we cracked the base pattern 40 minutes ago." Rael stared at the tablet. "You cracked a 2,000-year-old alien cipher in 40 minutes. 38 technically, we had 4 people on it." Bryn looked embarrassed. "The Conclave science team asked us to share the data. When I told them we'd already decoded the first layer, they went very quiet." Inside the suite, through the glass panel beside the door, Rael watched Siona draw another shape and Vaya lean forward with the focused intensity of something that very much knew what it was doing. He looked at Elder Sorath. "You said Vaya couldn't choose," Rael said, "that hatchlings only follow instinct." Sorath said nothing. What if choosing and following instinct are the same thing? What if Vaya's instinct was to find the one species that would actually open the key instead of guard it? Still nothing. Tavan was looking through the glass. She spoke without turning around. "The key was lost for 2,000 years, she said. "Every Conclave Science Division searched. Every Elder Council debated. Every archive was opened." She paused. "And a human woman decoded its first signal in 38 minutes because she was sitting on the floor talking to a hatchling with shapes drawn on paper." No one answered that. There was nothing to say that the silence hadn't already said better. 3 weeks into the journey to the Cradle Nebula, Vaya started drawing on the walls. Not random marks, not the way a small animal scratches because it can. These were deliberate, careful lines that took shape over hours, sometimes days, sprawling geometric patterns that Siona photographed obsessively and Bryn fed into every model he had. The ISV Resolute had been traveling at maximum sustainable warp since leaving Geneva Station, against the formal objection of the Conclave, the informal fury of the Velthori High Council, and the personal recommendation of Earth's Secretary-General to reconsider the diplomatic fallout. Rael had filed all of that under things to deal with later and set the heading. The 3 elders were aboard, not because they had agreed to come, because Velthori's sacred law required at least 1 elder to follow a hatchling wherever it went, and none of them were willing to leave Vaya unescorted with humans. Navan had not spoken to Rael in 11 days. Sorath spent most of the journey in the forward observation bay in perfect stillness. Tavan, quietly and without announcing it, had begun sitting near the doorway of the room where Siona worked with Vaya each morning. Nobody mentioned it. The wall drawings were the breakthrough. Siona realized it on a Tuesday, sitting in front of a section of corridor wall that Vaya had covered over 6 hours the previous night. The shapes were not geometry in the mathematical sense. They were memory. She had worked with enough alien species to know the difference between a mind building something new and a mind trying to remember something old. Velthori hatchlings were born carrying ancestral memory, fragments of racial experience encoded in the same biological structures that held their resonance abilities. Most of it faded in the first few years as the hatchling's own consciousness developed. Vaya was trying to surface something before it disappeared. "The pattern on the east wall," Siona said to Bryn, pointing. "That's not a frequency map." Bryn squinted. "What is it?" "It's a record, an event sequence." She traced the shapes without touching them. "This section here, these marks that look like a collapse point, I've seen something like this in Velthori historic archives. they used the same symbol structure to mark silencing events. Silencing, Bryn said, as in someone was silenced. As in someone was stopped from speaking, permanently. She showed Tavan that afternoon. The elder stood in the corridor for a long time, reading the wall the way you read something you already know is going to be painful. Her crystalline horns resonated at a low frequency that made the air around her feel thick. Then Tavan told them about Sorvan. Not Elder Sorvan, not the legend, the actual being, a Velthori who had lived 12,000 years and spent the last 2,000 of them piecing together a truth that no one in the conclave wanted to exist. The null tide was not a natural phenomenon. It was not a stellar anomaly or dimensional decay or any of the 57 theories the conclave's finest minds had published in the last century. It was a weapon. The Undrath had built it. The Undrath were one of the conclave's founding species, ancient, crystalline, cold in the way that very old things become cold when they stop believing that anything outside themselves matters. They had concluded somewhere in the deep past that the galaxy's problem was its variety. Too many species, too many directions, too much noise. Their solution was slow, patient, and elegant in the way that only very terrible things can be elegant. A wave of dimensional dissonance spreading outward across thousands of years, collapsing the resonance frequencies that biological life depended on, not destroying planets, not burning fleets, just making systems slowly uninhabitable, letting civilizations fail quietly. Sorvan had found the proof. He had also found the counter-frequency, the specific note that, broadcast from the right convergence point, would undo the entire structure. He had encoded it into the key. And then he had been silenced. The Undrath were still in the conclave, still respected, still on 3 of the inner council's permanent seats. You knew, Rael said, he was not angry, he was past anger. He was in the place on the other side of anger where things just became very simple and very clear. Tavan was quiet for a moment. I knew that Sorvan had found something. I knew that he disappeared before he could present it. I suspected the disappearance was not natural. She paused. I did not pursue it. I told myself it was because we had no proof, but the truth is that proof was not what I was missing. What were you missing? Courage, she said it plainly, without drama in the way that made it worse. We had been in the conclave for 40,000 years. We had positions, influence, history. The cost of speaking felt too large. She looked at the wall, at Veya's careful memory marks. Sorvan understood that the cost of silence was larger. He could not make us see it, so he waited for someone who had less to lose. Rael thought about Earth, about the 14 months, about 4 rejected proposals and an alien hatchling on a sunrise landing pad. We have nothing to lose, he said. We've been the bottom of this coalition since the day we joined. No one respects us. No one fears us. No one watches us carefully enough to worry about what we're doing. Tavan turned to look at him. Her horns resonated again, stronger. Yes, she said, that is exactly why Sorvan chose you. In the corridor, Veya had started drawing again. The new section was cleaner, more deliberate. Siona crouched beside the hatchling and watched the shapes emerge, and for the first time in weeks, the key in Veya's forepaws pulsed not gold or blue, but a color with no name she had a word for. She started looking for one. The convergence point looked like nothing. That was the first thing Rael noticed when the Resolute dropped out of warp inside the Cradle Nebula. No dramatic structure, no visible landmark, just a region of space where the gas clouds thinned slightly and the stars behind them seemed slightly too bright, like light was bending around something that wasn't quite there. Bryn had explained the physics 4 times. Rael had understood it twice and pretended to understand it the other 2 times. What mattered was simple. This was the place. This was where the counter-frequency had to be broadcast from. Because this was where the dimensional resonance was at its most open, a gap in the structure of space that the Undrath's weapon had not yet closed and wouldn't for another 8 months, after which it would never open again. Siona was in the back with Veya. Tavan was at the forward viewport. Navan and Sorath were in the elder quarters, and Rael had the distinct impression they were debating whether to physically stop what was coming. Then the Undrath ships appeared. 3 of them. They came out of stealth slowly, deliberately, the way something very large and very old moves when it wants you to understand that speed is for things that are uncertain about the outcome. They were beautiful and awful in the way that glaciers are beautiful and awful, massive crystalline structures that caught the nebula's light and split it into cold rainbows. The communication came through shipwide, no channel request, no hailing frequency. It simply arrived. Commander Dunmore, the voice was not unpleasant. It was the voice of something that had never had to be unpleasant. You are in possession of stolen Conclave property and a juvenile Velthori without custodial authorization. Stand down. Surrender the key. Return the hatchling to its elders. You and your crew will be escorted back to Geneva Station, where your Conclave membership will be reviewed. Rail sat in the command chair and looked at the 3 ships on the view screen for a moment. They called the key stolen, he said to no one in particular. Bryn at the sensor station said they built the null tide. They're worried about property rights. The comms officer, a steady woman named Petra, was watching Rail. Everyone on the bridge was watching Rail. He could feel the weight of it, all those people waiting to see what the human response to an impossible situation looked like. He thought about procedure. He thought about the Conclave emergency channel, the review board, the 6-week process Siona had mentioned weeks ago in a hallway that now felt like a different life. He thought about 14 months, which was now 11 months. He thought about the Undrath sitting on the inner council for 40,000 years while civilizations quietly failed around them. Petra, he said, open a broadcast, all frequencies, every inhabited system in range, no encryption. Petra's hands stopped over her console. Commander, that would be a direct violation of. I know what it violates, open it. She opened it. What Rail broadcast in the next 4 minutes was everything. Veya's wall drawings, photographed and formatted, Bryn's frequency analysis, Tavan's testimony, which she had recorded 2 days ago at Rail's quiet request, looking directly into the camera with 4,000 years of certainty in her voice. Sorvan's encoded records pulled from the key's second layer, which Bryn had cracked 6 days ago and which Rail had told no one about outside the ship. The full history of the null tide. The full record of the Undrath's role. The full account of Sorvan's silencing. Sent simultaneously to every relay in range. Every inhabited system that could receive it. Every conclave species. Every colony. Every planet that had lost a system to the tide and been told it was natural decay. Then he closed the channel and waited. The Undrath ships opened fire. What followed was not a battle in any honorable sense. It was 3 enormous ships that should have been untouchable trying to destroy one mid-class human vessel whose crew had decided that if they were going to fail, they were going to fail loudly. Rail burned through every emergency reserve, pushing the Resolute into the nebula's gas clouds, where the Undrath sensors were partially blinded. Petra threw everything they had at the comm systems to keep the broadcast alive and repeating. The ship took 3 hits that shook fillings loose and cracked 2 of the secondary corridors. The Conclave emergency channel erupted. Then it erupted more. Then it became something that no Conclave channel had ever been, not a controlled diplomatic discussion, but 30 species screaming at once, because 30 species had just learned that the star systems they had lost, the colonies they had abandoned, the billions of lives quietly ended. None of it was an accident. 2 Conclave ships broke ranks and moved toward the convergence point. Then a third. The Undrath pulled 2 ships back to intercept them. That left 1 ship targeting the Resolute. 1 was still enough to kill them. Commander, Siona's voice came over the internal comm, low and steady from the back of the ship. We need to activate the key, now, while there's still a ship to do it from. Rail looked at the view screen. 1 Undrath warship, 500,000 tons of ancient crystal and cold intent, moving toward them. How long do you need? He said. We're not sure. The mechanism requires 2 people, a Velthori anchor and a human direction giver. We found that out about an hour ago. Rail absorbed that. You found that out an hour ago and you're telling me now. I was busy figuring out if it would kill both of them. He gripped the armrests of the command chair and... A pause. Tavan has agreed to try. Rael closed his eyes for exactly 1 second. Then he opened them and started buying them time. The key had changed. It was no longer the small, warm object that Veya had carried across the platform at Geneva Station, held close to a soft chest with careful forepaws. It was still the same size, still the same double helix turning inside a sphere of living light. But the light was different now, not gold, not blue-white, but something that shifted between the two and never settled, like it was waiting for something to tell it which one to be. Siona had cleared the rear observation room. The walls were covered in Veya's drawings, 2 weeks of slow, careful memory marks that now, in the low light, looked less like drawings and more like instructions. She had realized that 3 days ago, she had not told Rael because he had enough to think about. Tavan stood on the opposite side of the room. Even folded down as small as a Velthori elder could make herself, she filled the space. Her crystalline horns were resonating already, a low harmonic that Siona could feel in her sternum and the backs of her teeth. It was not unpleasant. It was the feeling of something very old waking up. Veya placed the key on the floor between them. Then Veya looked at Siona. "I know," Siona said. "I know what you need me to do." She was not certain she understood the mechanism fully. The key's second layer had explained the what but not the how, and in xenobiology, the how was usually the part that killed you. The anchor was the Velthori role. Tavan's horns would fix the counter-frequency in dimensional space, hold it open and stable at the precise resonance the key carried. Without the anchor, the frequency would collapse in microseconds. Without direction, it would spread in every direction at once and dissipate before it reached the scale needed to reverse the tide. Direction was the human role. This was the part that had taken Siona an hour to explain to Rael and was still not fully explainable. The Conclave had never identified it because no Conclave species did it. Human emotional cognition, the specific way human brains processed intent, memory, and meaning simultaneously, produced a measurable quantum effect on dimensional resonance. It had been in the data for decades. No one had known what it was data of. Bryn had found it when cross-referencing the key's third-layer instructions with a paper from Earth's own physics archives, published 40 years ago and completely ignored. In simple terms, a human holding the key and actively thinking about what they wanted the frequency to do would shape the broadcast. The direction giver's intent became the aim of the counter-signal. The problem was that the interface was biological and the energy was not. "The key will read you directly," Tavan had said, quietly, 2 hours ago. "Your nervous system will be the antenna. I cannot tell you with certainty what that will feel like. Sorvan's notes do not describe it. He wrote only that it required someone who was not afraid to mean something." Siona had thought about that for a long time. Outside the ship, Rael was burning the last of the emergency reserves, running the Resolute through gas cloud corridors that the Undrath ship could not navigate as cleanly. The impacts had stopped for now. The 3 Conclave ships that had broken rank were engaging. It was not a good engagement, but it was enough of one to buy minutes. Minutes were what they had. Siona sat down across from the key, mirroring Veya, who had moved to her side. The hatchling pressed against her left leg, warm and solid and deliberately grounding, and Siona understood that Veya had done this on purpose. That this small being who had carried this thing across 2,000 years of waiting into the forepaws of the first generation that could use it was now simply sitting with her, because that was what it could do, and it had decided that was enough. She put her hands on the key. The light went white. Not blinding, not painful, not at first. It was more like standing very close to a sound that had no volume, a presence that was there in every part of her at once. She felt Tavan's horns activate fully, a resonance so deep it wasn't in the room anymore. It was in the room and the ship, and the space outside the ship, and some part of space that she didn't have a word for. She thought about what she wanted. Not in grand terms, not in species-wide declarations. She thought about specific things the way humans do. She thought about the outer colonies going dark, the way the news had come in when she was 17, and the grief had been strange because the places were so far away, and yet the people had been so real. She thought about Vaya on the platform in the sunrise, wobbling on new legs, holding something 2,000 years old, with the certainty of something that has never been taught to doubt. She thought about Tavan saying the word courage like it was the plainest and saddest word in any language. She thought, fix it, all of it, every system the tide has touched, send it back. The key broadcast. The counterfrequency moved outward at a speed that had no name in standard physics because it was not moving through space. It was moving through the dimensional layer beneath space, and it did not degrade as it went because Tavan's anchor held it true, and it did not waver because Siona's intent did not waver, and it reached the null tide's frequency across 1,000 affected systems simultaneously, and played the note that Sorvan had found 12,000 years ago and hidden for exactly this moment. For exactly this species, because he had looked at what the Conclave had built in 40,000 years and understood that there are things order will not do. The Undrath ship systems locked. Then the other two, mid-engagement with the Conclave ships, locked as well. Every circuit, every crystal array, every drive system, frozen by a resonance overload that had been engineered into their own weapons architecture. Sorvan had known who built the tide. He had built the counter-frequency to target them specifically. Siona was still holding the key when the light faded. She was on the floor. She did not remember lying down. The key was cold and dark in her hands. Vaya was pressed against her side, very still. Tavan was sitting against the wall with her eyes closed, breathing slowly, horns dim but intact. The room was quiet. Siona looked at the ceiling. Bryn, she said, to no one, to the empty room, because she knew someone was listening on internal comms. Yeah, Bryn's voice came through. He sounded like someone who had been crying and was not going to admit it. Yeah, the readings are it's reversing, all of them. Siona closed her eyes. Down the corridor, she heard Rael's footsteps. She knew them by now, the particular rhythm of someone who walks like they're always moving toward a problem. She heard them stop outside the door. Then she heard the door open. Then she heard him sit down on the floor next to her without saying a word. They stayed like that for a while. Vaya eventually climbed across both of them and pressed its nose against the cold key in Siona's hands, and made the small sound that they had all, by now, agreed was simply its name for things it loved. The tribunal took 9 months. Not because the evidence was thin. The evidence was overwhelming, meticulously documented, and supported by the recorded testimony of a 4,000-year-old Velthori elder who had decided that being 4,000 years old was long enough to carry something this heavy in silence. The tribunal took 9 months because 40,000 years of institutional order does not reorganize itself quickly, and several members of the inner council had to be formally suspended before the proceedings could even begin, which required an emergency vote, which required a quorum, which required 3 species that had been refusing to speak to each other for 2 centuries to sit in the same room. Humans were very good at sitting in rooms with people they didn't like. It turned out that was a skill the Conclave had undervalued. Rael spent most of those 9 months in meetings. He was not good at meetings. He was good at making the people in meetings uncomfortable enough that something actually happened, which was a different skill, and one that turned out to be in significant demand. Ambassador Dorath, in a closed session that Rael was fairly sure was not meant to go on record, told him that his approach to diplomacy was aggressive, irregular, and deeply exhausting. Rael said thank you. Dorath made a sound that the translator rendered as the insectoid equivalent of a sigh and said, it was not a compliment. Rael said he knew. The Undrath were contained. Their ships remained locked. Sorvan's resonance trap proved both elegant and stubborn, and the Conclave's best engineers spent 4 months trying to undo it safely before succeeding. The 3 Undrath who had given the order to fire on the Resolute were the first beings in Conclave history to face criminal proceedings under galactic law. The other Undrath, and there were many, presented complicated cases. Most of them had known, in varying degrees. The tribunals for those cases were still ongoing. The null tide reversed across 67 affected systems in the first month, then another 42 in the second. Some systems were too far gone, the reversal came too late for 3 dead colonies, and that grief was real and permanent and not fixed by victory. Rail made sure it was in every report. He did not let anyone call it a clean outcome. It wasn't, it was a human outcome, messy, incomplete, better than the alternative. Vaya grew. Not quickly in the way of short-lived things. Velthori hatchlings developed over centuries, and in the months since the convergence point, Vaya was only slightly larger, slightly steadier, wings now strong enough to fully extend. But the growth that mattered was not physical. Vaya had started speaking in the 3rd month, not in Velthori, not in any conclave trade language. In English first, then haltingly in 3 others, picking them up from the crew of the Resolute the way children pick up language, by being around people who use it for things they care about. Elder Navan found this deeply unsettling. Elder Sorath had returned to the Velthori homeworld without comment. Elder Tavan stayed. No one formally asked her to. She simply remained, the way large and patient things remain when they have decided that a place matters. She and Siona had developed a working relationship that neither of them would have called friendship out loud, but that everyone else called friendship without hesitation. They disagreed on 6 things daily and were in total agreement on the things that counted. On the 1-year anniversary of Vaya's arrival, Rail stood on the Geneva station platform at sunrise. The same platform he had checked. The Alps were doing what they always did with early light. Siona was beside him. Vaya was between them and slightly in front, wings half open to the morning air, scales catching the gold and throwing it back blue. The key was in Siona's hands, cold and dark and permanent. Behind them inside the station, the conclave was in session. Humanity had been offered a permanent in a council seat. The vote had passed with 31 supporting, 12 abstentions, 4 objections, 2 of which were Undrath allies and 2 of which were species that simply preferred things to stay the way they were, which, Rail had come to understand, was the oldest instinct in the galaxy and the most dangerous. A junior officer came out to tell him the session was resuming. "Tell them I'll be in shortly," Rail said. She hesitated. Ambassador Dorath said, "Tell them I'll be in shortly." She went back inside. Siona was watching Vaya, who was watching the horizon with the particular attention of something that is seeing a color it doesn't have a name for yet. In the past week, Vaya had started asking questions. Not the big questions, those came later, Tavan said, when the ancestral memory faded and the hatchling's own curiosity took over. Small questions. What is that mountain called? Why does the light change at the edge of the day? Why do humans always turn toward the sun? Siona had answered all of them. The last one had taken her a moment. "Because we're looking for what's coming," she had said. Vaya had considered this, then said in careful English, "That is a good reason." On the platform now, Vaya turned and looked at Rail. The violet eyes were steady and wide, and held the same quality they had held on this same platform a year ago, that unmistakable intentionality, the look of something that had chosen and was not uncertain about the choice. "Rail," Vaya said. The name came out solid and clear. "Yeah. What is the conclave going to do now?" Rail thought about the tribunal, the restructuring, the 40,000 years of careful order that had built something so stable it had stopped being able to see what it was stabilizing around. He thought about 31 votes yes. He thought about humans who had been members for 30 years and had produced more chaos, more disruption, more irregular, exhausting, aggressive progress than anything the Inner Council had seen in centuries. "Same thing it always does," he said. "Argue about it." Vaya made the sound that they had all learned meant something was funny, but that the hatchling was not yet sure if it was allowed to be funny. And what will humans do? Rail looked at the horizon. The sun was fully up now, the Alps lit and solid, and indifferent to everything that happened in their shadow. "Same thing we always do," he said. "Show up, make noise, refuse to accept that something is impossible just because no one's done it yet." Vaya spread both wings fully. The morning light hit the silver-blue scales and broke into something that had no name in any language, and for a moment the three of them stood there on the edge of the morning, a human commander and a human scientist, and a small dragon who had carried 2,000 years of waiting across the dark to the only species stubborn enough to open what they'd been given. Then Rael went back inside to argue with the conclave. Some things, after all, did not change, and that was the point.